President and semi-animated cadaver Joe Biden returned home in triumph yesterday from the most successful foreign trip of his presidency. But Captain, you disarmingly handsome rapscallion, I hear you say, didn't the president make a confused, doddering fool of himself like he always does? Wasn't the entire trip just a series of cringe-inducing gaffes and missteps and blunders? And for God's sake, didn't he even tell people they should honor the Holocaust? And right you are, dear viewer. The answer to all of those questions is, of course, an emphatic yes. So why am I calling this trip a success? I will tell you why. Because at least on this trip, he did not mess his trousers during an audience with the Pope, allegedly, or fart on the Princess of Wales. And since we call things down the middle on this program, it has to be said in the service of dispassion and objectivity that this trip was far less shitty than the last one. And I suppose that applies in both the literal and the figurative sense, but the afterglow did not last all that long, and not because Joe fell off of the airplane. And come to think of it, I think we should give him a charity point on his approval rating each time he successfully traverses the air stairs without causing himself either profound embarrassment or grievous injury, or both. No, the thing that killed the triumphant vibe was when Joe picked up a newspaper to see his average daily approval rating sitting at a robust 30%. And as these approval ratings of his continue cratering like Chicxulub with no floor in sight, it's important to keep sight of the fact that the people doing the polling almost exclusively are hardcore Democrat partisans who want the Democrat president to have as high an approval rating as possible. So you can bet they are massaging these questions and stroking that data just as hard as they can, doing every possible thing to puff up that number like a fluffer on a porn movie set trying to drag one last erection out of the coke-addled male lead. Seriously, I wouldn't be surprised if the current version of the question was something along the lines of, do you think President Joe Biden has been doing a good job since he replaced the woman-hating, xenophobic, racist traitor Donald Trump? But that wasn't the end of the indignity for the president upon arriving home, because as soon as he entered the White House, he was overcome by the stench of Axe body spray and designer hair gel, and that was when they told him that Gavin Newsom had come over to measure the drapes the other day. And despite the best efforts of the White House custodial staff, the stench of the Gavin seems to have permeated the entire building, right down to the structural beams. But this works out rather well for Joe and Dr. Jill, because it is another fabulous excuse to avoid going to the White House. Have we ever had a president and a first lady who detested the executive mansion so openly as these two do? Have we ever seen Joe Biden give an address from the Oval Office? I am pretty sure we haven't. Have we even seen a picture of him in the room? In an administration that defines itself by the bizarre and the cringeworthy, is there anything more bizarre and more cringeworthy than the fact that they built a fake Oval Office TV set in the House office building across the street where the president sits at a tiny little kid-sized desk to do his signing ceremonies and whatnot? I think we've become all so habituated to it by now that we need to remind ourselves just how freaking weird that is. Like, the actual Oval Office is less than 100 yards over there, and you're doing your presidenting on what looks like the stage for a Saturday Night Live sketch. Now, let's set aside the fact that he's too senile to tell his ass from a hole in the ground, and the fact that he's been a bumbling buffoon since long before he began losing his mental faculties. Just as a practical matter, if you wanted to appear more presidential and be taken more seriously as the president, wouldn't you have yourself filmed and photographed in the Oval Office, the seat of presidential power, every chance you got? I'll tell you what you wouldn't do. You wouldn't crack jokes about how you look around for the president each time you hear "Hail to the Chief." I mean, really, Joe? From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where the mandatory mask policy remains in effect, but only for Pramila Jayapal. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And we know, I think it's fair to say, to a fairly good degree of confidence, how things are going to go in our domestic politics over the course of the next year and a half, 2 years. The Republicans will crush the Democrats in this November's midterm. All of the rats will flee from the USS Biden and the USS Deep State before the new Congress is seated. And by rats, I mean every single person who's been engaged in criminal malfeasance and is thus likely to be the object of an investigation by a Republican Congress. And we'll have the unique spectacle of a first-term president being a lame duck for 2 years, assuming that Biden is allowed to finish out his term, and I continue to think the chances of that happening are probably negligible at best. If they had a vice president in place who wasn't a complete disaster, more unpopular than the most unpopular president of the last 75 years, they might have pulled the trigger on the 25th Amendment already. The fact that Joe Biden is the president is not going to help any Democrat in November, but elevating Kamala Harris to the presidency, that would help even less. So if you're asking me how I think this thing is likely to go, I think that much of 2023 will be spent laying the groundwork to first get rid of the vice president and then the president himself. And I don't think there's anybody else the Democrats can run as an incumbent president in 2024 except for Hillary Clinton. And I think they very much would like to avoid having a contested nomination for that matter. So I continue to think the most likely series of events is that Hillary gets installed in the vice presidency, and then she gets to hold the knife that stabs Biden in the back when they ultimately relieve him of his duties due to advanced age and cognitive decline. And after the palace coup is finished, and Hillary finally gets to live her dream of being the first woman president, and the only price she has to pay for it is her willingness to be defeated a second time by Donald Trump. But it's not so much our domestic policy outcomes that are on my mind these days. I'm thinking more about the geopolitical events that are likely to transpire during the same time period. And I ain't talking about no Russia or no Ukraine. I'm talking about our actual strategic and economic adversary, the People's Republic of China. And a lot of people thought China was going to move on Taiwan while Trump was in office. But those people are dumbasses, and they are not thinking things through. And here's why. Because there is one hell of a lot more at stake in any attempted Chinese annexation of Taiwan than whether we intervene militarily and whether the Taiwanese people wind up being held in bondage. Those are big considerations. Don't get me wrong. Nobody wants Taiwan to lose the democracy they've spent 70 plus years building from the ground up. But they are not, from our perspective, the biggest considerations, because the entire strategic balance of power in the world for the next 100 years may well hinge directly upon how the resolution of the Taiwan question winds up playing out. As a thought experiment, let's imagine China had made their move in 2017 or 18. It's a full-on amphibious assault. They achieve tactical surprise. They secure the island in less than 48 hours' time. So, since the whole world, including us, does not recognize Taiwan's existence, it's impossible for us to have a treaty with them saying that we guarantee their independence, but we are, I would submit, morally obliged to guarantee it because President Harry Truman shook the hand of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in 1950 and told him we would do that. And none of our presidents since that time has ever said that he wasn't willing to live up to that handshake. But it's not so much the military response, or the lack thereof, that I want to focus on here. I want to talk about the other part of the response. The part that we know would have happened had Donald Trump been the president when China moved against Taiwan. Now, President Trump would have wasted no time. The first response would be nationalize all Chinese property in the United States, then you expel all the Chinese nationals present in the country. Those things would be done within the first several hours. And bear in mind, to the extent that China has become a major world power these last 30 years or so, they have done it largely by siphoning off big old chunks of the U.S. economy, because that is exactly what our idiot leaders invited them to do. So if and when they move on Taiwan, it's not the potential of a military response that's going to give them the most pause. It's the potential of losing every damn thing that they own in this country, and losing the ability to pilfer our intellectual property whenever they feel like it. And what's more, if Trump was the president on the day of that invasion, he wouldn't stop the economic/diplomatic response there. Oh no, he would also say to U.S. corporations, You have got such and such number of days to divest yourself from China, and after that, all transactions between this country and that country are frozen. So you might want to hurry your ass up. But what if the corpse of Joe Biden is president when that invasion happens? Communist China has been Joe Biden's patron for the last 30 plus years. Hell, it's been the patron of the entire Biden crime family. To the extent that China has grown stronger at our expense, to the extent that the tendrils of the Chinese communist octopus reached all the way into the highest halls of power in Washington, D.C., it has been the life's work of people like Joe Biden to make it that way. Joe Biden was one of the people who told us, starting right after Tiananmen Square in '89, that if we open up our markets to China, if we normalize diplomatic relations, if we let them take, let's just say 2/3 of our manufacturing sector, then they will catch the freedom virus and China will miraculously transform into a Western-style liberal democracy without anybody having to fire a shot, and it'll be great. But much like everything else in the early 90s neoliberal globalist worldview that currently lies in ruins, all of that shit wound up being not remotely true, and yet somehow we persisted in having the people who got it wrong continuing to occupy high government office. But I guess that's the new version of the American dream, isn't it? It used to be, if you work hard and do a good job and play by the rules, then there is no limit to what you can achieve in this country. But then somewhere along the line, it morphed into something more akin to, well, if you have the right Ivy League degree, it doesn't matter how lazy and incompetent you are guaranteed to always fail upward into a better job. So if China were to invade Taiwan during a Trump administration, even if Taiwan wound up falling to communism, the overall result would be good for the United States, because just by taking the bare minimum economic and diplomatic steps in response to the Chinese aggression, we would finally be disentangling ourselves economically from our main geostrategic adversary, which would be a welcome return to some semblance of sanity, because you tell me, how much sense does it make to be facing down a rival who is only able to effectively oppose you because you have been letting him stick his garden hose in your gas tank since freaking 1990? But if they decided to invade with their good buddy Joe Biden in office, it's a matter of near certainty that the consequences would be much less disastrous to China. Can you picture Joe Biden nationalizing all the Chinese property in the United States? I can't. Especially not when that probably includes several of his own vacation homes. Can you picture Joe Biden ending diplomatic relations and expelling all the Chinese nationals in the country? I can't. He probably would get bombarded with calls from Democrat members of Congress saying, "Come on, man, there was this hot chick having sex with me every day and you sent her home, you bastard." What? Oh, of course she wasn't a spy. She said she loved me long time. So if you're the Chinese communists right now, and you want to grab Taiwan, and you want the ramifications to be as few as possible, don't you have to make your move while President Corpsey Cadaverton is still around? If you don't make your move in the next 2 years, then after that there's likely to be 4 more years of Trump and then 8 years of DeSantis. So take Taiwan and lose your economy, or take Taiwan and keep your economy. And it might just come down to a choice that's that simple. But here's the thing about China, economically. Even with everything we have let them siphon off from us, they are in a much more tenuous spot than they want anybody to know. They were having bank runs last week in a few cities. You may have seen the videos, which, in the most unsurprising development of all time, everybody in the American fake news media assiduously avoided covering or mentioning, because the last thing any U.S. news media outlet would want to do is question the robust strength and wherewithal of the Chinese Communist Party. They've taken trillions of dollars from us, both by hook and by crook, and they have dumped nearly all of it into rapid urbanization and rapid militarization. When you try to do such things on a crash program instead of doing them gradually and organically, especially when you're doing it with stolen money and stolen blueprints, you leave yourself open to some pretty calamitous outcomes if things don't go to plan. So yeah, your 2 new aircraft carriers are very impressive and all, but the other side of that coin is your citizens are bashing in the windows of their banks because they don't trust your government to keep their money safe. And in situations like that, when the leaders of a country feel its people getting restless and they fear a larger insurrection breaking out, they often react with some sort of military adventure, in the hopes that the fighting will unite the people and take their minds off the corruption and malfeasance of the government. And if you gain some new territory in the process, then, well, you can have a parade and celebrate, and everybody can act like they won the Super Bowl, and Bob's your uncle, everybody wins. The Argentines can tell you all about that scenario. In 1982, their country was being run by a military junta, but the generals were quickly losing the confidence of the people. The economy was going to shit. Journalists and political dissidents were being disappeared right and left. There was starting to be unrest in the streets, so they said, guys, we need a distraction here, pronto. And so you wind up with a hastily organized invasion of the Falkland Islands, or Las Islas Malvinas, depending on whose side you're on. There was only one fatal flaw in the plan. The Argentines never thought the British would actually fight over these two tiny little fly-speck islands that were 8,000 miles away from England and home to fewer than 2,000 people. And the British might not have fought had the Prime Minister been someone other than Margaret Thatcher. But in the event, they did fight, and Argentina got its ass kicked. The junta was toppled within 1 year, and all the generals wound up dead or in prison. And China's position today in 2022 might be closer to Argentina's position 40 years ago than anybody had realized previously. On the one hand, they may feel impelled to launch an adventure of military conquest in order to quell the unrest that's starting to happen in the streets. But on the other hand, if they launch the adventure and it succeeds, and they lose the financial umbilical cord between themselves and the United States, one on which they rely pretty heavily, the consequences could be so disastrous and so far-reaching that gaining possession of Taiwan winds up not even being a very good consolation prize. It could wind up being the act of belligerent conquest that unintentionally crashes the entire communist regime. And let us not forget, no communist government in the world has ever persisted for longer than 75 years. Soviet Union, 1917 to 1991, 74 years. Cuba, they're sitting on 63 years, and if they make it to 75, I will eat my hat. China, they have been communist for 73 years as of today. One more year and they will pass the Soviet Union to become the longest-lived communist regime in world history. And will they make it to 80? If I had to guess one way or the other, I think I would say no. And if they decide to make a move on Taiwan, they could be making the same mistake as the Argentinians made in 1982, which is to say, it could have the effect of merely moving up the date of their own execution. There are some people who know far more about this stuff than I do, who think that 10 years from today, not only will the Chinese communist regime have been swept away, but China as we know it today will not even exist any longer as a unified polity. It will disintegrate into 8 or 9 or 10 different regional states, and then there will be 100 or 200 years of constant Chinese civil wars and border skirmishes, just like there always used to be. It's become fashionable lately, in some conservative quarters, to casually remark that China is going to soon supplant the United States as the world's sole hyperpower, as if it's some inescapable foregone conclusion. I encourage you to not listen to such people when they say such things, because they're full of shit. The only way communist China supplants the United States is if our leaders actively help them do it, which they of course have been doing for quite some time now, which is why it would behoove us to get different leaders who hate our country less than our current leaders do. And we will leave it there for tonight. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I will see you Wednesday. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.